In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
An effective strategy is a process of shared learning. We are dealing with complex challenges across our organizations, across our communities. There are no definitive single point solutions that we can come up with. These are not technical problems. These are complex challenges. So effective strategy is a process, an ongoing process that has open participation across the organization and leadership guidance. It combines both of those. The leadership guidance comes from framing the conversation, creating the safe spaces, and then guiding the conversation around four critical questions to answer where are we going and how will we get there.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hi, and welcome to episode 41. My guest today is Ed Morrison. Ed directs the Agile Strategy Lab at Purdue University, and for the past 25 years, he's worked on a new approach to developing strategies to address complex challenges. His methodology is called strategic doing, and it emphasizes the strategic value of collaboration. This was a really enlightening conversation for me, and one of the reasons is that Ed brings a refreshing approach to strategy creation. Even his definition of strategy is completely different from what I have ever come across. He says that strategy is a process of shared learning that has open participation and leadership guidance. He never uses the word vision, and there's a very good reason for that. And he says that the main function of leadership today should be bringing people together and guiding them through a skill of asking better questions. I love this approach, and I love his credo, which is, unsurprisingly, a question. Imagine if we had a world in which we can all contribute to building a sustainable future. What would it look like? So if you are looking for an effective way to address any complex business challenge, you will definitely benefit from listening to this episode and from reading Ed's book, Strategic Doing. I hope you enjoy listening to this interview and that you learn from Ed as much as I did. Here is Ed Morrison. Ed, welcome to Culture Lab.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Aga.
I'm very happy to have you, and I can't wait to talk to you about strategic doing. But before we do that, I'd like you to give our listeners just a very short introduction to who you are and what you do.
I'm a director of the Purdue Agile Strategy Lab, where we develop new approaches to managing complex organizations and situations, and then also the founder of the Strategic Doing Institute, which is an offshoot of Purdue's strategic doing work at the lab.
Yeah, fantastic. We'll talk about strategic doing in a second. But before we do, I want to ask the question that I always ask at the beginning of every single interview, which is, what were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? In other words, what made Ed Ed?
Well, it's interesting. I was in preparation for this podcast. I was listening to others, and the one that hit me the most was Greg Satel's, and he talked about his background as a wrestler. Well, I was a competitive swimmer when I started out in 10 years old, and
Were you?
and
Wow.
went all the way through college, competing at the national level. And that was really an important dimension for me, primarily because it taught me the value of discipline. And oftentimes people think of discipline as something negative. It's something that, you've been disciplined, if you will, if you think about it that way. But actually, discipline is a very rewarding set of habits. And the paradox is obviously that by creating some disciplines for yourself, you actually open up new horizons for yourself. And that was really something that I learned in swimming. The other aspect of swimming was just simply staying at the practice, keeping going and practicing day after day. And the value of that, the value of practice. So those two things, I think, created a sense of persistence in my career. And so that persistence, I think, shows up today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's paradoxical, isn't it, that constraints and, as you say, discipline sometimes actually can generate more freedom and more space for us to be innovative and creative.
Well, what it does is it forces you to go deeper, and I think that's what's so exciting about it is that as you go deeper, whether it's in a discipline like a sports discipline or a meditation or prayer discipline or any kind of discipline that you can think of, as you go deeper, you discover new worlds, you discover new senses of reality, and you discover new connections, and all of those things are very, very valuable. If we stay on the surface too much, you get the problems with our social media today, which is basically you bounce around from one thing to the next, and your attention never stays in one place for very long. So the discipline actually, I think, is a very liberating aspect of what we do, and it really did have a lot to do with the work that we currently do in our lab now.
So let's talk about the work. But first, I want to say congrats on your book, Strategic Doing. It has just been published by Wiley. And we'll delve into it in a moment. But first, I have a question about the author of the book's foreword. So normally in a book like yours, you'd have someone like, I don't know, Roger Martin or Dan Tapscott writing the foreword. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one who was surprised to see that you had Yo-Yo Ma, one of the most famous cellists in the world. And his first words in the foreword are, I've been waiting for this book all my life. Wow. So you have to tell us, how did that come about?
Well, we don't do much advertising. We don't do any advertising actually in our lab. And so people call us up. And one day we got an email from Yo-Yo Ma's office. And I thought it was odd. In fact, I threw the email away. I didn't think it was, I thought it was some kind of a solicitation for something.
Did you think, or a joke or something, right?
A joke, yes. But then I got a call on my phone from Yo-Yo Ma's office. So I obviously returned that, and I learned about what Yo-Yo is doing. He's combining his performances with what he calls days of action, because he believes very strongly that culture and the role music plays in our cultural organizations can bring a fractured world together, can bring communities together. And over my career, I've done a lot of work with cultural organizations, and I believe very strongly that that's true, that culture is the table around which we can gather. He had asked me, or his office asked me, to come to Youngstown, Ohio, to do a workshop after a performance that he had with the Cleveland Orchestra.
So did you get to see the performance as well?
No, I didn't. I was too busy. So I actually ended up, they gave me about a week to prepare for this. So I was actually on another project, and I dashed over to Youngstown. And we had about a 2-hour workshop. And the workshop was really designed around what could cultural organizations do how do cultural organizations now have a role to play in pulling together communities? And what Yo-Yo was able to see was a discipline in that 2 hours where we can take a group of people who've never worked together before, never maybe even met each other, and through a discipline, we can guide and formulate complex collaborations, new opportunities, and actually generate a strategic action plan, what we call a strategic action plan, where we're actually taking an opportunity and testing it very quickly. And so he saw that and was very excited about it after the session. He gave me his email and said, let's stay in touch. So when the book came out, I thought, well, maybe he'll be interested in doing a blurb for us. And so I asked him whether he could do a blurb, and he came back and he said, no, I'm too busy, but why don't you send me the book? So I sent him the book, and came a couple weeks later, I said, well, Yo-Yo, could you, have you looked at this? Could I interest you in doing a blurb? What if I even wrote a blurb based on what we've talked about, at the Youngstown, you could just approve it? And so I sent him an email thinking, okay, well, maybe I can entice him to do a blurb, because again, Yo-Yo's, I'm impressed by his spirit, impressed by what he's trying to do. I think is very, very important. Well, he sent me back 3 paragraphs, and those 3 paragraphs are the forward to the book. So I asked him whether we could just use it as a forward to the book, and he said, of course, graciously, yes. So I was stunned. Yeah, I was stunned. But I think the most important point here is that what Yo-Yo is trying to do is demonstrate to us that we can come together on deeper levels, and that culture opens the door to these deeper levels. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about discipline. This notion that if we can transcend or go deeper beyond the day-to-day, beyond the surface conflicts that we face, and we have deeper conversations, we can actually find collaborative potential. And that has a very, very important message, not only for our communities, but also for our companies, because again, it requires us as leaders to lead in a different way. And Yo-Yo is a wonderful example of someone who's really taking his gift and sharing it. And so we're really happy that he saw fit to read the book and then to comment on it, to give us a great forward. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's an amazing testimonial, and I really love him. So it was wonderful to see that he loved the book as well, and he finds your approach so useful. So speaking of those deeper conversations and the necessity for leaders to be able to have these deeper conversations to bring about change. In your book, you talk about 10 skills to be able to use this approach effectively. So which ones would you say are the most important for a leader today? Our listeners are mostly leaders in companies, corporations, entrepreneurs. And if you were to say 2 or 3 skills out of the set of 10 that they really need to nail, which of those skills are they?
So before answering that, maybe I can give you a little background, I think, as to why we're even talking about these kinds of skills. One of the important insights, I think, that we've developed over the years is that obviously in order to deal with complex challenges, we have to be able to have conversations. And one of the insights that we have is that complex collaborations emerge out of conversations that have an underlying structure. They have an underlying structure, and that leaders, if they understand that structure and they can guide that structure toward a trajectory of collaboration, they can do that, and remarkable things happen. Remarkable collaborations emerge.
Can I stop you here just for a second, because I just got curious about something. When was the first time that you realized that there is an underlying structure?
So that happened to me. I was a consultant for about 20 years, working in communities and regions dealing with globalization. So globalization it continues to be a very, very difficult transformation for many communities and many regions. And having done a lot of collaborations, both in the US and in Mexico and Europe and in China, I started to realize that complex collaborations emerge out of conversations that have an underlying structure and trajectory. And I learned that by the late 1990s. I had started this quest in about 1993, and that story's in the book as well, of where all this started. But by 2001 timeframe, 2002, I was pretty convinced that there was an underlying structure, and I came to Purdue primarily to learn how to teach this underlying structure.
Right.
And it turns out that problem of trying to teach something is a very difficult one to solve. It's not, it's one thing to understand the structure. It's quite another to develop the teaching materials and the language and the visual language that you need in order to teach this to all types of people. Everybody
Absolutely.
from neighborhood activists to defense analysts and engineers at NASA. I mean, you have to be able to teach these skills, and we had to come up with one way to teach it. So that's what took a while to figure out how to do that.
And I can imagine that it also helped you to understand your discipline even better, because this is what a lot of people say, that when you start teaching something, you really get to understand the subject at a very deep level. So was this the case for you as well?
Yes. Well, we'll at some point go into the 4 questions and the 10 rules, and I'll explain, or 10 skills, and I'll explain how the 10 skills emerged out of teaching time and time again the 4 questions. And but you had asked about what are the 2 skills that are one or two skills that are so critical. And so the first skill is creating a safe space for deep, focused conversations. And why is that important? Amy Edmondson at the Harvard Business School has written a wonderful book called The Fearless Organization. She has really pioneered this concept of psychological safety, as you know. And the point of this is that until you can create that safe space, and this has both got a physical and a cognitive dimension to it, until you can create that safe space, you won't have collaboration. You will have gamesmanships. You'll have all sorts of games, and we see that every day in meetings. People saying one thing and doing another. People not following through on commitments. People kicking the can down the road. All of these behaviors are wasteful from the standpoint of the organization. Yet, in order to break that habit, you first have to create the safe civic space, or the safe space that people can come to, where they can have these conversations, and you have to be willing to enforce it, and you have to be willing to set a new standard of conversation. And
so this is really fascinating, and I probably can imagine that for our listeners, it's easier to imagine what they need to do to create a safe space in physical terms. So no distractions and reducing the noise, internal, external. But I think something that people very often struggle with is how to create that psychological safety.
Right.
So would you be able to share a few tips around that?
So there's two dimensions of this. One is creating a very simple rule. And we start all of our workshops with a simple rule, which is we're going to behave in ways that build trust and mutual respect. And the reason we do that is because trust is what's going to power the collaboration. So we want to build trust through this whole process. So we say, look, we're just not going to behave in ways that erode trust. And we appoint someone who's going to be the guide. We talk about guiding instead of facilitating in strategic doing. And we have someone who basically enforces the rule. Beyond that, though, you can start to think about the hierarchy that comes into the room. In any organizational setting, people have a hierarchical mindset. So either if it's an open community, a region, whatever, people are putting themselves in different positions within a hierarchy. And one of the aspects of networks is that, and Greg Satelba made at this point, is that this transformation happens when people start thinking horizontally. And so or side to side. And so it's very important that people regard each other as roughly equals. Everybody's got gifts and assets that they can bring to a solution to a complex problem. And so if you start treating everyone not as and we use a card game to illustrate this, but not as a king or a queen or a deuce or a 3 or a 4, but everybody is treated as a 10, then you're starting the mindset of, yes, this is kind of flattening this implicit hierarchy that exists in the room. So let me explain it with a story. In Flint, Michigan, which many people have heard about Flint because of its collapse of its water system. But in Flint, Michigan, we've been working for 8 years. And our colleague there, when he first started doing work, in order to create the safe space, there is a hierarchy within the community. There's corporate execs, there's philanthropy or foundation executives, and then there's neighborhood people. And there's an implicit hierarchy. Well, Bob asked everybody to bring out their business cards, and everybody did. And they, thinking that they were going to introduce themselves or do some kind of icebreaker. Then what he did was he passed around a trash can. And he said, put your business cards in the trash can because we don't care about your position. We care about your gifts. What are you willing to share? And that was a very powerful message that said, look, outside this room, the hierarchies matter. We're not going to erase the hierarchies. But inside this room, when we're trying to design complex solutions or come up with experiments to address a complex, wicked challenge, we have to treat each other as equals. And so very important.
And I guess that probably in a way that's easier to achieve when you bring people together when they haven't met before, because you don't have that power dynamic yet. And it's probably more challenging in companies or groups where this power dynamic has already been established maybe years ago. So I wonder if you have any advice to our listeners what to do in a situation where, it's evident that there is the CEO and then there are middle managers and frontline managers, and they don't have equal power. And so how can they come together in a conversation where they start treating each other as equals?
Well, again, a lot of this has to do with how the top executives or the senior people in an organization frame the potential for collaboration. We have one young engineer who came to us and told us that he had been voluntold. He talked about being voluntold to be on a team and to lead a team. And of course, his boss essentially got off on the wrong foot by telling people, you can't tell people, as you point out, you can't tell people to have a culture change. But what you can do is create a space. And we talk about platforms within organizations. And in companies, the idea of platforms is becoming more and more prevalent. But this notion that we have to have a space in which we collectively, as a team, are going to work together to solve a complex challenge. These are what we call adaptive problems. They're not technical problems. Technical problems are, okay, I broke my computer and I need somebody to fix it. That's a technical problem. An adaptive challenge is disruptive innovation or a new competitor showing up or the continuous failure of lean projects across the organization. These are adaptive challenges that don't have any single solution to them. They're very complex. And so the question is, how do we come together and come up with some hypotheses about what could work, what we could do together? And in that kind of an environment, again, part of the challenge for leaders is to create the environment in which these conversations are possible. So one company with whom we started working, we suggested, look, the best way to do this is to convert you have all hands meetings. And oftentimes these meetings are, the top leaders talking to people. They sit on a stage or there's a panel discussion or some kind. Why don't you instead take that time and make it more of a forum where you have guides at every table, you have round tables, you get people talking, and you get people working together on a question that you are interested in addressing. And so change the regular all hands meeting from a hierarchically structured meeting to more of a collaborative meeting, and just start practicing how to have these kinds of conversations. And
absolutely.
doing that,
what I love
trust.
about that is that you give leaders the opportunity to actually walk the talk and implement those things and demonstrate, that they don't just say, yes, your voice matters, but actually they invite people to share their ideas and their thoughts.
So after one of our workshops, I mean, this was exactly right. After during our workshop, the senior management team of this company pulled out their calendar and said, okay, well, we've got these gatherings already scheduled. Let's redesign the experience. Let's make it less us talking to people, and let's have more conversation across organizations. And it's stunning to me how few times these conversations are happening. I mean, we've had conversations with a large manufacturing company talking about the future of this company, its product roadmap. And it was the first time that cross-disciplinary teams, cross-divisional teams were in the same room together. Well, how are you gonna solve these complex challenges if you don't foster deeper conversations? And so starting that process, just one of the things we talk about, Aga, which is important, I think, for people to recognize, is that if you want to go fast, if you want to move your organization toward agility and toward speed and more of a network-based management, you have to go slowly at first.
Yeah.
So again, another paradox, to go fast, go slowly. So start small, start slowly. And again, this is same evidence that came out of Greg's work in Cascades. You don't
the keystone change, right?
Yeah, you just don't flip a switch you look for small changes that you can make, and you do them repeatedly. You don't, One example of this is bringing people together in the Charleston Digital Corridor, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. The first thing we did was create Fridays at the Corridor, which happens once a month. We bring together people. It's a forum. We have conversations. And Ernest Andrade, who's been the mastermind behind the Charleston Digital Corridor, he's been doing that for 17 years. And it's just, again, it demonstrates how you have conversations, how you treat people on an equal plane, and how you have these deeper conversations that enable people to connect and to explore ideas and to see what are the gifts or what are the hidden assets that we all have.
Yeah. So I'm curious, when you facilitate those get-togethers where people can share with the help of a guide, do you have a set of rules that ensure that there is psychological safety, or does it happen spontaneously? How does that work?
Yeah, so it doesn't happen spontaneously, and this is one of the reasons that when we were putting together strategic doing, we rejected the idea of facilitation. We said, look, it's really not facilitating. The people who are doing these workshops are guides. They're like river guides or mountain guides. They're on the trip with you. We are on the trip with you. And so we established certain rules about how this workshop is going to be run. And the purpose of the workshop is to come up with a strategic action plan in a matter of hours. And so strategy now is much more like software development. It's much more version 1, version 2, or version 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And so you're continuously upgrading your strategy as you learn what works. And so when you're dealing with complexity, you can't predict complexity. You can't sit and unlike strategic planning, which tried to predict the future, you can't really predict this. What you can do is launch a beautiful phrase that comes out of my business school colleagues at the Darden School is learning launches. They talk about learning launches, which are small projects designed to help us learn about where are the leverage points in this hidden complex network that we're trying to design. Where's the 20% that's going to give us the 80%? And we don't know that. And so you have to develop that. So guiding is really an important aspect of strategic doing. And that's why we set it up as an open source discipline, but you really do need to be trained in it and you need to practice it. It's not something you read a book. And the book itself is designed to get people out and starting to practice these skills. The first skill you said was set up a safe space. So that's
right.
an important one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What would be the second one?
Well, a second one is to frame a strategic conversation. So here we have an important couple of points to start with. First, when we started working on how do we design a strategy for open, loosely connected networks, I tried for 2 or 3 years to figure out how I might take the strategic planning models that I had learned at Ford and General Electric and at my consulting career, and how could I adapt these to networks? And what I learned was you can't really do that. It doesn't work. So we started from ground zero. I'm trained as a lawyer, so one of the things that's important to me is definitions. And so I started with the definition, what is a strategy? And what I determined was, well, let's define this rigorously. A strategy tells us where are we going and how we will get there. So it answers these two questions. Where are we going and how will we get there? So one of the next skills that we have to focus on is how do we frame a conversation, a strategic conversation? And here we draw a lot from the lessons of appreciative inquiry, which is developed at Case Western Reserve University by a wonderful researcher named David Cooperrider. And Cooperrider essentially has some very important insights in his work. One is people move in the direction of their conversations. Why is this important? Well, if we're working with a really complex problem, there is no way to get a root cause analysis to that problem. We can't really figure out the root cause of, say, one of the projects we worked on, teenage homicides in Flint, Michigan. There is no root cause. I mean, if we head down that path and we try to figure out what is the problem here, we will go, and we see this every day on television, people talking about problems and they just come up with other problems. And so you get a problem-centric conversation, which exhausts people. One of the insights is that what we need to do now when we're facing these complex challenges is we have to frame conversations around potential opportunities. So we talk about a framing question. And framing questions have several important characteristics to them. They start out typically with a structure like, how could we? What would it look like if? Imagine if. And this is the invitation to design the future that we can't see yet. Yeah. So it's an important insight, is that strategic doing is not trying to fix an old problem. We're trying to design what's next. And we have to bring people around to figure out how do we take the assets that we currently have in our organization and start to recombine these assets in new and different ways to create a better system that gets us better results.
So this is a very important point, and I think a very interesting point for our listeners as well. So could we use an example? I literally today received an email from a potential client, and what she said was, I was sitting in our leadership meeting, and we had this conversation about how we lack trust in our senior leadership team, but also generally in our organization, and how that is stopping us from being able to fulfill, our potential and meet our targets. And she said, could you help us with creating a culture of trust? So I think just using this example, what you are saying is that working, for example, with this client, you wouldn't really focus your attention on why don't we trust one another, but you would focus your attention and this whole line of questioning, what would it look like if we had trust in our team, right? Is that correct?
Exactly, because what again, this lines up well with what Greg talks about in his cascades. People have to see in their own mind's eye the future that they want to move toward. Yes. And so when you start designing a future where people can start to share the mental images of what that future might look like, now you're starting to get emotional engagement from people. Yeah. And it's the emotion, it's not data, it's not facts that move people. It's emotion that moves people. And if you can guide a conversation, a shared conversation around a shared future that they can start to see together, and there's an intersection about what that might be, then you can start to move people toward that future. Now, you're not going to design it all at once in one workshop. But what you will do if you head down the problem-centric path is you'll start getting into blame games. You'll start getting into arguments. You'll start getting rehashes of old history. You'll start getting, and essentially what you're going to do is you're trying to treat the lack of trust in an organization like a technical problem, as if the battery in your car has died and you've got to figure out, okay, well, how do I find out why my car doesn't start? This is a technical problem, but the lack of trust is a complex problem. It's your organization is a complex adaptive system. Your culture is complex. And so part of what you need to be thinking about is, how do I start to move people toward trustworthy behavior? We all know what trustworthy behavior is. And in strategic doing, our first rule, as I said, emphasizes the importance of trustworthy behavior. And the reason why you need trustworthy behavior is not because it's a nice thing to do. Of course, it is a nice thing to do, no doubt about it. But you cannot do complex thinking without it. You cannot do complex thinking without an environment of psychological safety. So this is not a eyewash. This is not a simple thing. This is a fundamental insight. And leadership has to be to start to change the culture. And you change the culture not with dictates, but with action. Absolutely. With action. And people won't change their behavior based on what you say. They will behave. They will change their behavior modeling what you do. And so part of, as I said, we start small. Change the monthly all hands meeting into a forum where you're discussing and you're giving people time to listen to one another and talk to one another in a controlled way. A lot of hierarchical management treats this fearfully. They think, oh my gosh, if I start opening up my organization this way, it'll be chaos. And the answer is no. If you manage it, it won't be. You will have open participation and leadership guidance. And those are two things that can go hand in hand. It's not a top-down process. It's not a bottom-up process, because what you're doing is building bonds of trust across a network. And there are no, in a network, there is no hierarchy to speak of. There is some, but from all points of view, there is no top or bottom to a network. That's the important point. And so thinking about that way is probably not very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's going to be relevant. In your book, you mention a term from the Nobel Prize winner, Herbert Simon, and the term is satisficing, right? So could you share what it is and why it's not the best we can do as a group that's trying to find the best solution?
Well, a couple of points here. One is, if you think of this as a technical problem, there's an optimization or an optimal solution that you can get to. This is really what strategic planning was designed to try to accomplish, was the optimal solution. If you're dealing with a complex challenge, which is in the book, we talk about just planning a family vacation, what you're looking for is a shared outcome. And what complexity science teaches us is that companies and organizations are now competing on a dancing landscape. And there are many, many different opportunities for the organization. There's not just one place that you can end up in. You can end up in a lot of different places. And that would be better from where you are today. And so part of this is understanding that it's not a situation where you're trying to force one person's perspective, one person's view. So, for example, we don't use the term vision in strategic doing because it's too one-dimensional, and for a whole lot of other reasons as well. But part of it's not a situation where the top leadership is demanding a vision and then forcing that vision, pushing that vision down through the organization. What the top leadership is doing is asking the important questions of value creation and opportunity for the organization that pulls people toward it. So it's very much of a situation where people get engaged in a process of defining what the outcome is. And so we talk about outcomes instead of visions. And it's a shared outcome.
Can we use this example of the family vacation just to illustrate this whole concept to our listeners?
Right.
I think in terms that everyone can relate to.
Right.
So you're saying you have a family, and imagine that it's the parents plus 3 kids, right?
Right.
And you need to decide where you're going to go on vacation. I think everyone can relate to that if they have kids and they know that it's not an easy decision to take.
Right.
So what would be the right approach to this problem or to this challenge?
If we just started out and looked at what people wanted to do, maybe the son wants to go to a natural park. Maybe the mother wants to read on vacation. Maybe the father wants to go somewhere warm on the vacation. And they each may have their ideal vacation place. So the children may want to go to a natural park in the mountains. One other child may want to go to a national park on the seashore. The mother wants to go to some place where she can get access to a library or something like that. Yeah. If you try to put all of those 4 things together, you will never figure out how to come up with a vacation in 2 weeks. But if you have a deeper conversation about what is it that matters to you about this vacation, what do you really want this vacation to be? What kind of experience do you want this to be? Then you can start, when you start at a deeper level, you can start to design a future vacation that will satisfy everyone. And it won't be perfect for everybody. Everybody's got their own, but it will be good enough. And what we've learned in our work is that if people listen to one another and they start to share what really matters to them, then they can start to design a shared outcome that they are pulled toward by their emotional engagement. They really want to do it. And so that's what moves the network forward. And it requires leaders to have these deeper conversations.
And I understand why you said that the first skill is creating that safe environment, because clearly for people to open up about what really matters to them, they need to have that psychological safety.
Right.
And open up and start talking about this.
But again, talking about culture, I mean, if you think about culture, we think about it in a pretty clear way. We say culture is the pattern of the way in which we think, the way in which we behave, and the way in which we do things together. So those 3 things.
Behaving and doing is not the same thing, as you say in the book. So can you tell our listeners what the difference is?
Between thinking and doing. So thinking in a different way is, again, going in, Bob Brown, by throwing the business cards into the trash can, was automatically getting people to think a different way. He said, look, your outside position doesn't matter in here. What you all have are gifts that can help us solve this complex problem that we have. And that's where we want to begin. So we don't want to spend time hearing all of the hierarchical positioning that goes on in a meeting. What we want to do is get right down to what are the assets that we have. What can we share to help us try to solve a complex adaptive problem that we have? How do we address this problem? How do we learn? So that's changing the way in which people think. Changing the way people behave is, of course, again, learning how to behave in ways that build trust and mutual respect. We all know that kind of behavior, and we all know what kind of behavior erodes that. And so occasionally, not often, but occasionally we've had to invite people out of the room when they are behaving in ways that undercut the trust building operation or trust building activities that we're engaged in. Why do we invite them out of the room? It's uncomfortable, but we do that primarily because we're reinforcing the behavior that we want to see. And we're telling people, we are not going to waste your time. We've all been in meetings that have been disrupted by people. And so part of this challenge is, of course, part of the challenge of disruption comes from bad behavior. Bad behavior essentially wastes time. And so part of what we're trying to get to is this whole notion that we need to behave in ways that build trust and mutual respect. And then the doing is all part of what kinds of questions are we going to ask? That's the lessons that you learn in the book of what kinds of questions and what kinds of skills are very important to get people to work together collaboratively and start experimenting with potential solutions to a new to a new challenge.
Yeah, yeah. So, Ed, shifting gears a little bit here, how would you describe a truly effective strategy, especially today, as you've mentioned throughout this interview? We operate in a very complex, unpredictable environment. So, what does an effective strategy today look like?
An effective strategy is a process of shared learning. We are dealing with complex challenges across our organizations, across our communities. There are no definitive single point solutions that we can come up with. These are not technical problems. These are complex challenges. So effective strategy is a process, an ongoing process that has open participation across the organization and leadership guidance. It combines both of those. The leadership guidance comes from framing the conversation, creating the safe spaces, and then guiding the conversation around 4 critical questions to answer where are we going and how will we get there?
Yeah. So what are these 4 questions of strategic doing?
So the 4 questions, so when we start thinking about strategy as emerging out of a conversation, we had to ask ourselves, all right, we have strategy. The starting point was, where are we going? How will we get there? If we have those, if we answer those 2, by definition, we have a strategy. We learned that converting that into a conversation, we could do that by asking 4 questions. The first was, what could we do? In other words, what could we do? It's very much of a brainstorming type of question. What could we do with the assets we have access to right now to help us solve our framing question? The imagine question that I talked about earlier. Yeah. What could we do? So here's a very divergent part of the conversation. We're looking at trying to, 1, uncover hidden assets and connect these assets in new and different ways, very much like recombinant innovation happens, where you combine new assets and create new opportunities. And so the question is, what could we do? The next question is, what should we do? Of all the things we could do, we have to make some decisions. So here we talk about a big easy, which is we want to find the big ideas that are easy to do. We want to start where we can get some quick wins, generate some traction, generate some momentum. That, as again, going back to Greg's book, The Cascades, talking about the buzz that you can create by moving forward on a big easy, is that you can create buzz. People start paying attention and they get interested in what you're doing. So could
you
we
give us an example from your work of what the big easy initiatives were from the organizations that you worked with?
So one of my favorite ones is life scientists at NASA called us up and said, "Hey, we need to figure out how to collaborate across. We have life scientists who deal on the molecular level all the way up to human physiology, and we're not collaborating very well. So can we come together in a workshop and figure out how to do this?" My favorite, so we identified what our assets is. We framed the conversation for the workshop, for the 2-day workshop. Imagine if life sciences and NASA were far more collaborative and productive, what would that look like? Something simple like that. We identified assets within the networks that we all had. So we each had assets that we could share to help us answer that framing question. And the big easy that came out of that was something called an Uber mouse. I mean, we came up with several big easy, but one was the Uber mouse. And the idea was that, okay, we're all doing mouse experiments, but genetically these mice are all different. So what if we developed an Uber mouse that we could share across our experimental labs, and therefore make the ability to share data, share outcomes, share insights more valuable. So it's something, oftentimes, because we operate in these silos, in my consulting career, I almost always would end, I don't really care what you do, but I do care that you do something. And chances are that doing something is going to be on the level of putting the shower curtain on the inside of the bathtub. I mean, there's probably something really stupid that you're doing, which through collaboration, through just talking to one another, you can stop doing the stupid things and avoid. And so big easies are often just putting the shower curtain on the inside of the bathtub. That is something as simple as that.
And they usually have a major positive impact on the issue, right?
Well, they do. And, again, part of the dysfunction of our current organizations is we operate in these silos. And rather than trying to eliminate the silos, because again, I agree with Greg Sittel here. I mean, you don't really want to eliminate the silos. You do want to foster collaboration across the silos. And so how do you do that? Well, you do that not once, but you do that routinely. And this is part of the strategic conversations that you design and guide. And so the job of leadership is a process. It's an ongoing process of having these conversations. They're not long. They can be 2 hours, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. They're not huge. You can do them every 30 days. You can do them 90 days. But it's a frequent strategic conversation where people are pulling themselves up out of their day-to-day. They're looking at the horizon and they're reflecting and thinking about, what could we do? What should we do? And then the third question is, what will we do? What will we do? Yeah. And the fourth question is, what's our 30-30? And the 30-30 is a learning loop. It comes out of the early work that I did in Oklahoma City, where we had a 30-30 meeting where we got together every 30 days to ask ourselves, what did we learn in the last 30 days? What are we going to do the next 30 days?
Yeah.
And so those are the four questions of strategic doing. The first two questions, when you answer them, give you an outcome, where you're going. And the second two questions give you a path, how you're going to get there. So if you guide a group through these four questions in the space of 3 hours, they can come up with remarkably sophisticated strategies. Is it perfect? No, there's never a perfect strategy. Is it enough to start moving and start experimenting? Absolutely. You can start moving right now. Go. And so that's what's important.
That's what's important. That's what's critical. And you underline that in your book as well. You give this example with a kayak, right? And when you need to go to an island on a lake, was it a lake? I think so. And there are many different ways of approaching that. Of course, you can sit and plan, but probably the best idea, actually, if you want to get there before the sunset, is to just start pedaling, and then you will figure out what is the wind and how fast you go and whether you need to speed up or not. But if you don't start, then you really can't know what you will face, and you are not making progress. You are not learning.
Right. I mean, as I was putting together strategic doing, starting to do this in the late 1990s, I was doing a lot of ocean kayaking. And so the parallels seemed to me, so the parallels seemed to me very, very important, because again, you can sit all day on the beach and try to plan but you'll never understand what the impact of the current is on your boat, wave action on your boat, wind on your boat. You'd never know any of that. You can make a good guess, and then you got to get in and paddle. And if it's calm weather, you pick your head up, maybe every 5-10 minutes and kind of reset your course, make sure that you're on where you want to go, and then you get back to paddling. If it's particularly turbulent, then you're picking your head up, maybe every 10 paddles, every 10 strokes, and you're setting your course. Much like a company, an organization, you have to continuously reset your course based on what's happening to your kayak, what's happening to your organization, and what are you learning about the different forces that are acting on your organization.
Absolutely. I think it's a wonderful way to wrap up our conversation about your book and about strategic doing. I'd like us to move to the rapid fire questions now.
Sure.
These are 5 questions, and I'll ask these questions in rapid succession. The first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
Well, we define organizational culture by the patterns of thinking, behaving, and doing within the organization.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
The nature of the conversations that are happening. If the conversations are not strategic in the sense of where are we going and how will we get there, if they're instead about smaller matters, then chances are the organization doesn't have the right culture yet.
And are there any companies that you admire for their culture?
Well, I was impressed by our work with Amgen over in the Netherlands. Their top management team embraced
Amgen, the pharmaceutical.
We went and did a workshop with them. They embraced immediately these ideas, And that's the company that I was talking about that started rethinking how they're going to get together and change the way in which they have company meetings.
And are there any books on culture or leadership, apart from your book, obviously, Strategic Doing, that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, I'll recommend 3. Gregerson has Questions Are the Answer, which is a very important book. Warren Berger's book on A Beautiful Question, and Amy Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization. All 3 of those are
fantastic.
very good books, and I would highly recommend them all.
Excellent. And we'll post them in the show notes for our listeners so that they can find them easily. So, final question of this series of questions. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life? I know that you don't use the word vision, but so maybe let's rephrase it. What will help them to achieve what they need to achieve and go where they want to go?
The key to leadership in the going forward in the coming decade is going to be the ability to ask questions, to lead by asking questions. And so engaging in a conversation, learning how to design conversations with questions, learning how to lead the conversation with questions is a critical skill that leaders have to develop. And so you learn how to do that by simply doing it. So the next time you invite someone to a coffee or bring a group together, rather than having a fixed telling agenda where you're sitting there talking at people, maybe start out with the question, or at least allow part of the session to be an open question and where people are listening to one another, because the mere act of listening to each other starts to build trust.
I know that it's very difficult probably to give a definite answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you have a favorite question that you find yourself asking over and over again?
We have a credo, that is very important. It's in the book. Imagine if we had a world in which all of us can contribute to a sustainable future. What would that look like? And part of what we are doing with Strategic Doing is asking each of us to answer the question, what is it that we're going to hand to our kids and our grandkids? Because ultimately, that's often what's been lost, is this generational responsibility we have to take the resources that we've been given, the gifts that we have, and to hand them in a better condition to someone following us. And we don't do that, but that's really what Strategic Doing is really designed to help us do, is help us figure out, what is the company going to look like? What is the organization? What is my community going to look like? And start thinking about that and doing something not 6 months from now, but today and tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you very much for that. And finally, I want to ask, who would you recommend as the next guest on the podcast? I'm looking for people who have been successful in consciously and intentionally cultivating a culture that supports them in achieving a meaningful purpose, or leadership thinkers, management thinkers, or someone who has something interesting to say about culture.
Well, I would look at Hal Gregerson as a person that would have some very keen insights that would be helpful. Again, he's the author of Questions Are the Answer. And to me, it's that whole focus of learning that leadership now is bringing people together and guiding them through a skill of asking powerful questions.
Love that. So in closing, is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Well, we invite everyone to, enjoy the book. If you do enjoy the book, please think about participating in a growing movement in Australia, the U.S., Canada, Europe now, where we're all working to learn together about how do we build human collaboration so it's more productive, more sustainable, because we have these really complex challenges and we have to learn from each other.
Absolutely. And I definitely would like to encourage our listeners to get the book because it's wonderful. I've made my way through to half of it approximately, and I found it extremely useful. So I'm looking forward to finish it soon, maybe over the next weekend. So thank you for sharing this experience and knowledge with us and doing all this work, because it's clear that we need to solve a lot of complex problems nowadays.
Right.
And so giving people the right tools to be able to do that is really important work.
You can engage us on strategicdoing.net, which is a website for the institute that I mentioned. And again, we have colleges and universities that are teaching strategic doing. We now teach it in Dutch and in Spanish. And so we encourage people to participate and join and learn from each other about how to address these complex challenges.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And it is a community, as you said,
Yes.
so they can reach out and connect with others and exchange experiences. So it's really wonderful because you can really learn from each other.
Yes.
Well, thank you for creating that platform, for sharing your knowledge again, and thank you for being our guest.
Thank you, Aga, very much for the opportunity. I've very much enjoyed it.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab podcast yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review the podcast on iTunes, or actually anywhere else that you listen to it. And before we say goodbye, I want to give you a preview of my next interview with Zeynep Ton. Zeynep Ton is an adjunct associate professor of operations management at MIT Sloan School of Management, and she's also the co-founder of the non-profit Good Jobs Institute. Before MIT Sloan, Zeynep spent 7 years on the faculty of the Harvard Business School, and her research explores how companies can design and manage their operations in a way that satisfies customers, employees, and investors simultaneously. In 2014, Zeynep published her findings in a book, The Good Job Strategy: How the Smartest Companies Invest in Employees to Lower Costs and Boost Profits. I wanted to speak to Zeynep for a while because if we are really serious about cultivating healthy and adaptive cultures, we have to focus on the architecture that is going to support them. And designing and managing the operations is a vital part of that architecture. So have a listen to this snippet from my interview with Zeynep, where she talks about why it makes business sense to invest in people.
Bad jobs cost companies a lot more than they realize. They put companies in a vicious cycle where customers end up getting a worse service and higher prices. Companies lose a lot of money on lost sales, lost productivity, lost profits. And then, of course, the outcome for workers is terrible. And this situation, if you look at it, nobody really wins in this situation. So I thought there has to be some other way. And when I looked at some companies that were simultaneously able to offer good jobs to their employees, great outcomes for their investors, and great value for their customers, I found that the key to doing that was creating an operating system, so making specific choices that both leverage investment in people and also require investment in people.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lab. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.